everyone, welcome back to Jenny Actual Speaking. I am Jennifer Clyde, of course, and it's time for lesson 43. Today we'll be talking about a kind of sickness known as motion sickness. Of course, when it comes to motion sickness, there's seasickness, car sickness. We can also get air sick when we take a plane, so you may be very sensitive to motion. Of course, now what are the causes of motion sickness? They say that we, of course, can sense movement. For example, the ear, of course, our vision and our sensing or nervous system that senses motion. Now, these are very important to help us balance. But if one of these can't, indicate that our body is moving or cannot sense motion, and all the others do, there will be a break in balance. And that is exactly when we get sick, often motion sickness. So are you the type that gets sick when you go on a long car ride, a boat ride, or even when you take a plane? We'll be talking about that today. So let's get started. Let's begin with our warm-up segment, also the 5 W's and how questions. As always, let's begin with our first W question, which happens to be who. That's right. Now, by now, you know all the 5 W questions. What are they? Who, what, when, where, why, and we'll finish off with the how question. The first 2 question is, do you get motion sickness? Now, let's focus on the keywords as we brainstorm today, okay? So, do you get motion sickness? Do you get sick? Do you get motion sickness? Also, who do you know that suffers motion sickness? So, the keyword here is who. Do you know? Now, we're not talking about yourself, but we're talking about somebody else, somebody that you know that suffers motion sickness. Another what question or what category? What type of motion sickness do you suffer from? So with this question, yes, focus on the type of motion sickness. All right, let's brainstorm rather quickly today. So what type of motion sickness do you suffer from? What type of transportation do you avoid taking because of motion sickness? So the first W question, what question was, what type of motion sickness do you suffer from? The next one is, what type of transportation do you not take, avoid because of motion sickness? Another what question, what kinds of symptoms have you experienced? So think about the symptoms you experienced because of motion sickness. Moving on, what types of motion sickness symptoms have you seen others experience? That's right, we're not talking about you experiencing it, but other people, okay? What kinds of motion sickness symptoms have you seen other people experience? Our next what question is, what do you do? So what do you do to avoid motion sickness? Think about the things you do. People say ginger tea is actually really good. Apple juice is good as well. There may be many, many other things you can do to avoid motion sickness. So what do you do to avoid motion sickness? Okay, here we go. What is your own remedy? A remedy is another word for cure. Solution, in this case, I would say cure. So what is your own special cure or remedy for motion sickness? What do you do to lessen the symptoms? If the symptoms are really, really serious, what do you do to alleviate it, to lessen the symptoms? Moving on to our when category. Now, when do you usually experience motion sickness? Perhaps in a car, bus, plane, boat, ship, okay? Think about those. Now, when did you start? Now, that's the keyword. When did you start suffering motion sickness? Think about when it all started. Ever since you were little? Maybe recently? Also, where were you traveling to? Think about a time you got really, really sick because of motion sickness. And also, it's a great way to talk about where you were going, where you were traveling to. Now, why do you think you're sensitive to motion? Why do you think you're sensitive to motion? There may be many reasons, but that is also a question you can ask yourself when you talk about this topic. And our final how category. We've got 4 questions for you. How do you feel when you experience motion sickness? So focus on how you feel. Do you feel dizzy? Now, do you feel nauseous? So think about how you feel. Also, how bad is your condition usually? Condition meaning motion sickness, right? How serious is it? How bad is it? Do you throw up? Do you whatever? So think about how bad your condition is. How long do your symptoms last? This time, talk about how long the symptoms last, whether they last for just 5 minutes or through the whole ride. And our final how question. How did you get over it? Now, to get over something means, right, you are okay. So you may start getting sick. You may have nausea. You may suffer dizziness. But then again, if you say, I got over it, you no longer feel nauseous or dizzy. So think about these how questions as well. How you felt, how bad it was, how long it lasted, and how you got over it, okay? Focus on those keywords. That is all for today's brainstorming cues, everyone. Brainstorm more on your own, and let's begin by listening to Actual Talk.
So, Rachel, have you ever been on the high seas?
Not on the high seas. Yeah. Have you?
Yeah, I've been on a couple of oceans, and I've been on some big boats and some little boats.
Okay.
I was on a sailing boat, like a 32-footer, up on Lake Superior.
Oh, okay.
In some pretty windy circumstances.
Lots of tossing and turning.
Yeah, and then I was on a ferry in really bad weather from Athens to Santorini.
Okay.
And it was a big boat, but it was all over the place. And pretty much everybody on the boat was throwing up over the
Oh, my
sides.
goodness.
They were all green around the gills.
Did you get motion sickness?
Yeah, I was just fine.
You're
actually.
so lucky.
Yeah, I have a pretty strong stomach. What about you?
I have
Can you handle that
terrible
stuff?
motion sickness.
Really?
Cars, buses, boats. I usually don't go on small boats or ferries because I know I will vomit because I have. I vomited in cars and in buses because of the motion sickness. I get really dizzy, I get really nauseous, so I have to take over-the-counter medicine before I go on long road trips.
Oh, really?
I do.
The only thing that bothers me is if I read for too long in a car.
Yeah, I think
you need to look far away.
Yes,
in
that's
order
what I do.
to center yourself. One of the things that might have helped me is growing up canoeing a lot.
Oh.
So that might have gotten me used to it. I don't know. Got my sea legs that way.
But you know what they say? So when I tell people that I'm car sick, that I get car sick very easily, they say, "Oh, are you from the country? Like I've never ridden in a car before." But I was thinking that it's because back at home I always do the driving myself, right?
So you're always looking.
I'm always looking at a distant point, but here I'm always the passenger, and that's when I get, and I'm not used to that. I guess.
So if we go anywhere, you should drive,
I
and
should
I'll be a
drive.
passenger.
Sounds perfect.
Welcome back, everyone. Did you enjoy today's Actual Talk? Of course, Peter and Rachel were talking about motion sickness. Now, what did Peter say? He seems to be pretty good with motion. He's not very sensitive to motion, I guess. So he does not get sick very often because of motion. Whereas Rachel, she sounds like she's pretty sensitive to motion, so she gets car sick quite easily. Okay, let's take a look at the dialogue, the conversation between the two. Now, of course, Peter begins by asking, have you ever been on the high seas? The high seas. High seas itself means the ocean, okay? A broad, wide area of water. So, have you ever been on the high seas? Have you ever been out on the ocean, for example? And yes, Rachel asks, have you? Now, Peter says, yeah, I've been on some big boats and some little boats. So he's been on all different kinds of or sized boats. He says, I was on a sailing boat. Those are rather small boats, like a 32-footer. For example, let's just take a look at this. something something footer actually means you're indicating the length or the height of something. So he's talking about a sailing boat, and he says a 32 footer, meaning it was 32 feet long, okay? So the sailing boat was 32 feet long. The sailing boat was a 32 footer, okay? Always a, and then add the length, and then finish off by footer, okay? Now, he says in some pretty windy circumstances. So he was on a sailing boat, a 32 feet long sailing boat, when in some pretty windy circumstances, meaning the wind was blowing, okay? Strong winds. And then Rachel says lots of tossing and turning. Now, remember seeing this expression? We talked about toss and turn, tossing and turning when we were talking about sleeping habits, right? Now, when we sleep, if we say we toss and turn, what does it mean? It means you cannot sleep well because you're moving from this position to another position. But in this case, yes, tossing and turning meaning because the wind was blowing so hard, the boat was moving from one position to another. It's very shaky, okay? All right, and then Peter says, yeah, and I was on a ferry in really bad weather from Athens to Santorini. Now, what is a ferry? Simply put, when we go to the Hangang River, we often take the ferry, right? They're boats that usually would take to close destinations. So that was a ferry, but he was on a ferry, or he took a ferry in really bad weather. Okay, but he says, but it was all over the place. Now, before we talked about tossing and turning, here he says it, meaning the ferry was all over the place. Now, what does this mean? It's very similar to tossing and turning, but it's not just moving from one direction or one position to another. In this case, it's all over the place, moving from here to there to here, okay? So he's saying, yes, there was a lot of movement. The ferry was crazily moving from this place to another. And then he says, and everybody on the boat was throwing up over the sides. This is something you would say when talking about boat rides. And when people get sick, they throw up over the sides. Now, boats have sides, right? So when you get sick, you don't necessarily go to the restroom, the bathroom to throw up. You just throw up on the sea, right? So he's saying everybody on the boat was throwing up over the sides of the boat. And they were all green around the gills. Now, gills is often used with an S. Gills is basically the respiratory organ of fish, for example. I think it's called agami in Korean. So this is just a way of saying people were green, meaning they were very, very sick. They were throwing up. They were all green around the gills, meaning around the neck area, okay? And then she says, did you get motion sickness? What did he say? I was just fine, actually, meaning he did not get motion sickness. I was fine. I did not get motion sickness. I have a pretty strong stomach. Now, have a strong stomach. This means what? Of course, stomach here means, yes, our stomach, okay? But when you say I have a strong stomach, it means that you usually don't get sick. When you smell something really bad, when you see something really bad, or when you see something very disgusting, you usually don't feel sick. You're fine. Now, in that kind of situation, you would say I have a strong stomach, which means you do not get sick easily. I have a pretty strong stomach too. Anyhow, he asks, what about you? Can you handle that stuff? Are you okay with that stuff? Okay. Now, Rachel says, I have terrible motion sickness. So she is the very opposite of Peter. I have terrible motion sickness. Cars, buses, boats. I usually don't go on small boats or ferries. Why? Because I know I will vomit. That's true. So if you have terrible motion sickness, you know. Sometimes you're afraid to go on these boats or go on long, drives or car rides because you know you're going to throw up. Another word is vomit, as we all know, right? It's not overeat. It's not overeat. I always try to say vomit or throw up. So she says, I know I will get sick. I know I will vomit. So I don't go on small boats or ferries, which means I don't ride small boats or ferries. And she talks about a time in the past, I vomited in cars and buses because of motion sicknesses. Now, I get really dizzy. Now she's talking about the symptoms, how she feels. I get really dizzy. I get really nauseous. So I have to take over-the-counter medicine before I go on long road trips. Let's focus on these symptoms. First of all, dizzy. We all know dizziness, right? Everything is just going in circles. You can say, I feel dizzy or I get dizzy. What about this? Nauseous. Have you heard of nausea? That's right. If you say, I get nauseous or I feel nauseous, it means that your stomach, there's something wrong there. It feels strange. You want to vomit. When you get that feeling of wanting to throw up, you can say, I get nauseous or I feel nauseous. So she says, I have to take, when we take medicine, we don't eat medicine, we take medication or medicine. I take over-the-counter medicine. It's also called OTC medicine. It's long. It's over-the-counter. So OTC medicine, basically, over-the-counter medicine is medication or medicine you can easily get at a drugstore or a pharmacy without a prescription. Okay? So she takes medicine or OTC medication before she goes on long road trips. And then, yes, Peter says, the only thing that bothers me is if I read for too long in a car. Read for too long in a car. I think usually people get sick from reading in a moving automobile, right? A bus or a car. And then he says, I think you need to look far away in order to center yourself. Center yourself in this case means to perhaps balance yourself, right? Okay, so, and then she says, yeah, that's what I do. I try to do that too. I look far away, far out into the distance. Now, Peter says, one of the things that might have helped me, so he's talking about perhaps a reason he is not very sensitive to motion, is growing up canoeing. Grow up doing something means do something ever since you were little, continuously. So, I grew up canoeing means ever since I was little, I canoed, right? So he grew up canoeing a lot. So that might have gotten me used to it. So because he grew up canoeing, he got used to movements. And he said, I got my sea legs that way. Now, what is sea legs? Sea, ocean, legs are legs. That's right, sea legs. Usually say, I have sea legs. Or in this case, I got sea legs. It means you're able to balance yourself in really shaky circumstances. Perhaps you're on a boat. It's very windy. There are big waves and tides. So the boat is shaking, moving from one place to another. But still, you don't fall down. You're able to balance yourself. You can say, I have sea legs in that case. Okay? And then Rachel says, when I tell people that I get car sick easily, they say, oh, are you from the country? She's just joking. But I was thinking that because back at home, she's talking about back at home, meaning back at home, her home country where she comes from, I would always do the driving myself. Meaning I always drove. I was always the driver. I'm always looking at a distant point. That's true. When you're driving, you're looking far away, right? So she's saying, I think back at home, years ago perhaps, since I was always driving, I was always looking far away. But here in Korea, I'm always the passenger. I'm not used to that, I guess. So maybe that is why she tends to get sick when she is in a car, because she's the passenger here in Korea. Now he says, so if we go anywhere, you should drive, and I'll be the passenger. So perhaps this may work out. Now, just as Rachel said, usually the driver does not get sick, does not get motion sickness because you're looking far away. But usually passengers do because you're, I guess, focusing on things near you and also reading things as well. So that was maybe a solution they can work on. Okay, that was our actual talk for the day, everyone. Take a listen to it one more time and also check out the subtitles.
So Rachel, have you ever been on high seas?
Not on the high seas.
No?
Yeah. Have you?
Yeah, I've been on a couple of oceans, and I've been on some big boats and some little boats.
Okay.
I was on a sailing boat, like a 32-footer, up on Lake Superior.
Oh, okay.
In some pretty windy circumstances.
Lots of tossing and turning.
Yeah, and then I was on a ferry in really bad weather from Athens to Santorini.
Okay.
And it was a big boat, but it was all over the place, and pretty much everybody on the boat was throwing up over the
Oh my
sides.
goodness.
They were all green around the gills.
Did you get motion sickness?
Yeah, I was just fine.
You're
actually.
so lucky.
Yeah, I have a pretty strong stomach. What about you?
I have
Can you handle that
terrible
stuff?
motion sickness.
Really?
Cars, buses, boats. I usually don't go on small boats or ferries because I know I will vomit because I have. I vomited in cars and in buses because of the motion sickness. I get really dizzy, I get really nauseous, so I have to take over-the-counter medicine before I go on long road trips.
Oh, really?
I do.
The only thing that bothers me is if I read for too long in a car.
Yeah,
I think you need to look far away.
Yes,
in
that's
order
what I
to
do.
center yourself. One of the things that might have helped me is growing up canoeing a lot.
Oh.
So that might have gotten me used to it. I don't know. Got my sea legs that
maybe.
way.
But you know what they say? So when I tell people that I'm car sick, that I get car sick very easily,
Yeah.
they say, "Oh, are you from the country? Like I've never ridden in a car before." But I was thinking that it's because back at home I always do the driving myself, right?
So you're always looking
I'm always
outside.
looking at a distant point, but here I'm always the passenger, and that's when I get, and I'm not used to that. I guess.
So if we go anywhere, you should drive,
I
and
should
I'll be the
drive.
passenger.
Sounds
Okay.
perfect.
Now that we've listened to today's actual talk twice already, let's take a look at some actual talk expressions. Expressions, phrases, vocabulary you can use when talking about motion sickness. So, as we all know, when it comes to motion sickness, there's car sickness, air sickness, and also sea sickness. So think about those expressions, and let's focus on ways to talk about the different types of motion sickness. Let's say, for example, you are not very sensitive to motion. Just like Peter, you can say, I don't get motion sickness easily. I don't get motion sickness easily, meaning you don't get car sick easily, you don't get air sick easily, or seasick. But if you're the opposite, if you're very sensitive to motion, you can say, I'm prone to. Prone to meaning there is a big possibility of something, right? So I'm prone to motion sickness means I get motion sickness easily, okay? These are the opposite, okay? You don't get motion sickness, you do get motion sickness. Let's talk about the different types, okay? When you say, when I travel by car, bus, or train, I get car sick, okay? So when you travel by car or bus or train, you get car sick, everyone, okay? And what about this one? When I'm at sea, you're out in the ocean. At sea, I get seasick. That's right, okay? When you're on a boat, out in the ocean, you get seasick. Keep that in mind, seasick. What about this? When I fly, when you go on an airplane, a plane, you get air sick. So all you need to do is focus on these. Car, sea, air, okay? Car, bus, or train, you get car sick. Now, when you're at sea, ocean, it's water, right? Sea, seasick. And finally, when you fly up in the sky, you get air sick. There's air in the sky, so air sick. Quite simple. Now, ways to talk about motion sickness symptoms. Let's talk about that. My symptoms of motion sickness are nausea. Remember, nauseous. The feeling of wanting to throw up. So, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, okay? It's also symptom of motion sickness. Another one, sweating. Some people sweat, okay? And also feeling discomfort. So these are just a few examples of the symptoms of motion sickness. You can say my symptom or symptoms of motion sickness is or are blah, blah, blah. Wanting to throw up, vomiting, throwing up, dizziness, feeling dizzy, also sweating. You're sweating and also feeling discomfort, meaning just feeling very uncomfortable, feeling sick. Moving on. Long winding roads. Winding means curvy, okay? Curvy roads, long winding roads make me feel what? Dizzy is another one. Lightheaded. Now, we did talk about dizziness, but you can say dizzy. It makes me feel dizzy or lightheaded. These two actually mean the same thing. Now, lightheaded, head, we're talking about head, but how does it feel when your head feels really light, as if it's floating in the air? It means you feel dizzy. So, the next time you want to say dizzy, try using this expression. I feel lightheaded. I feel dizzy. Another one. Now, long boat rides. We're talking about boat rides. Make me nauseous. Now, practice using nauseous, or woozy is another word for dizzy. Okay, woozy, dizzy, and also queasy. Now, queasy and nauseous mean the same thing. Queasy, if you say I feel queasy, it means I feel like throwing up. So, once again, nauseous, nauseous, woozy, woozy, and queasy. Queasy. Good job. Jerky movements make me break out in a sweat. This is just a fancy way of saying I sweat. I start to sweat. But jerky movements, what is a jerk? Okay, a jerk is kind of a sudden movement. It can be a push or a pull or a twist, a sudden movement. So jerky movements, you're on a car, for example, and it goes boom, boom, or some kind of sudden movement is a jerky movement. So these kinds of movements make me break out in a sweat, make me sick, so I start to sweat. Okay, now oscillating motions often make me want to vomit or throw up. Same thing as we took a look at vomit and throw up. Okay, but what is oscillating? This is also movement. Basically, movements back and forth, up and down. Okay, up down movements or back and forth movements are oscillating movements. Oscillating movements. Also, I take over-the-counter drugs or prescription medication. Now, these are ways to talk about motion sickness prevention. So what do? You take medication. OTC drugs, okay? Drugs or medicine you can buy at pharmacies easily, or prescription medication, meaning you need a prescription. Okay, 처방전이 필요한 그런 약이 되겠죠. Okay, I wear behind-the-ear patches. I think we wear those patches behind our ear sometimes to prevent people or ourselves from getting motion sickness. You can say, I wear behind-the-ear. 귀 뒤에 붙이는 거니까요. Behind-the-ear patches. You can also say, I make sure that I eat before I travel. They say this helps as well. What about this? I make sure that I stay hydrated. I make sure something. It means you do it no matter what, okay? I stay hydrated. It means you drink plenty of liquids, okay? You drink many, many, many drinks. Lots of liquids. Lots of water, for example. Okay, let's quickly move on to our next category. These are ways to talk about cures and remedies for motion sickness. Quickly, I prepare ginger tea with honey just in case. Just in case I get sick, I prepare ginger tea with honey. These actually help, so keep them in mind. I pack some apple juice. Apple juice is known to help motion sickness, to prevent motion sickness. I drink decaffeinated tea at the first sign of motion sickness. Now, at the first sign of something, meaning when you somehow feel that you are getting sick, you get a hint or a feeling, oh, I'm starting to get sick, that's when you drink decaffeinated tea. Okay, moving on. I chew on something to relieve mild car sickness. In this case, it is mild, not very severe, not too serious. In those cases, I chew on something, whether it's gum or cookies. And a few more. If traveling by car, I sit in the front seat. That's also a good idea. I sit in the front seat. I never read, and I look at the horizon. I look at the horizon. I look at distance is also another one, right? We took a look at that. Distance, or look at the horizon, or focus on a distant point. A distant point is actually a faraway point, okay? And, I guess that about wraps it up then. So these are a few cures and remedies that you all can keep in mind if you happen to get car sick or seasick or air sick quite easily. Okay, now practice using these expressions and other ones with your partner or even on your own, and let's move on to our next segment. All right, everyone, today we are talking about motion sickness. We're focusing on motion, so I chose an idiom that has the word motion in it, okay? So try to guess what it means. Relax, everyone. I don't want you to get motion sickness right now. Now, today's idiom is to go through the motions. To go through the motions. To go through something means to experience in many cases, right? Try to guess what it means. Here is a sample sentence. These days, when we're together, I get the feeling that he's just going through the motions. These days, when we are together, when my husband and I are together, for example, I get the feeling that he's just going through the motions. I know it's difficult. Here is the definition. To go through the motions. In Korean, it means 하고 싶지 않으면서 해야 하기 때문에 마지못해 무엇을 하다. 무엇하는 신용을 내다라는 말이에요. 신용을 하다. You're just doing it just because you're expected to or have to. So the definition is to do something because you are expected to do it and not because you want to do it. Okay, well, here is another sentence. I wasn't crazy about the family trip, but I just went through the motions. I wasn't crazy about the family trip, meaning I didn't really want to go. I wasn't really excited to go on this family trip, but because I was expected to go, well, I just went with the flow. I just went through the motions. I did it just because I had to. Okay, try using to go through the motions the next time you find yourself doing something just because you have to. All right, that is a wrap for today's Idiom Attack.
Talk about your travel experiences when you suffered motion sickness. When do you usually experience motion sickness? How bad was your condition? What were your symptoms? And how long did it last? Also, talk about how you got over it.
Basically, I don't have any motion sickness in anywhere. For example, train, ship, boat, car, vehicle. In anywhere, I don't have motion sickness. But when I start to read any kind of material like book or tablet PC, that brings me dizzy. And yes, motion sickness. And another thing, once I ride on the airplane, and when the airplanes began to fly up, I felt terrible sickness in my ear. I know that is because of change in air pressure. But anyway, I felt really sick, and when I swallowed the saliva, and then I felt better. That advice was from my mother.
조성아님, 감사합니다. Thank you very much for the wonderful interview. So what did he say? Does he normally get motion sickness? No, he's not that sensitive to motion. But when he flies, when he takes a plane, for example, he does feel a bit uncomfortable. He feels discomfort, in other words, right? So let's check out what he said. First of all, super job. He said, I don't have motion sickness. You may think, oh, that's simple. But then again, if somebody asked you, so do you get sick? Do you get motion sickness? How would you answer that question? Wonderful answer. I don't have motion sickness. Another great point. That advice was from my mother. Now, he talked about a time he went on a plane, and what did he say? He said he swallowed his saliva, and that was a tip his mother gave him. So, yes, talk about who gave you that tip. That advice was from my mother. In other words, my mother gave me that advice. Okay, let's check out a few oopsies. The first one is when I start to read any kind of material, okay, like, moving on, giving examples, like book or tablet PC, that brings me dizzy. And yes, motion sickness. First of all, I would say good approach, wonderful approach. If we made a few corrections, it would be perfect. I like that you actually added a lot of information here, detailed information in one sentence. Let's see, when I start to read any kind of material, any kind of reading material such as books or tablet PCs, that brings me dizzy? Let's figure out how we can do this. When I start to read any kind of material such as, or like, books, now we're talking about all different kinds of books, or tablet PCs, I feel dizzy. It's very simple. Don't try to use difficult words or don't try to make it fancy. Make it as simple as possible. So when you do this, you can say, I feel dizzy, and they bring on motion sickness. They meaning, yes, reading materials such as books or tablet PCs, they bring on motion sickness. One more. Once I ride on the airplane, and when the airplanes began to fly, take a look at the tense. Once I ride on and then began to fly up, I felt terrible sickness in my ear. The tense is going back and forth. Ride and then passed and then passed. Let's see what we can do. I once flew. Talk about your past experience. I once flew, or I once went on an airplane, and when the airplane began to fly up or take off, I felt a terrible pain in my ears. So, as always, pay attention to the tense. Don't go back and forth. Keep it past, keep it present, keep it the same tense. I flew, went on, began to, I felt a terrible pain in my ear. Okay, job well done, everyone. Hope you don't make the same mistakes in the future. Now, today we talked about motion sickness, everyone. I know that it's a terrible feeling to want to vomit or throw up whenever you go on a car ride, a bus ride, or even go somewhere on a plane. Now, I would not know because I'm not that sensitive to motion. But as I did mention, we have our sensory nerves and our vision and the inner ear that actually helps us to balance. And if any one of these senses, they don't sense that we are moving and the others do, that is when we get car sick. They say that usually women tend to get more car sick or motion sickness compared to men, and infants or children under 2 actually are not affected by motion sickness. And yeah, that's just some extra info for all of you out there. Now, next time I'll be joining you with another great topic. We'll be talking about weather, all different kinds of weathers. So that is to come next time. In the meantime, come and visit us at our homepage. Come to www.ebse.co.kr and check out 10 Point Actual Speaking. Come by, leave us some comments, questions, check out our scripts and some extra expressions and tips. They're right there for you. Okay, until next time, take care and bye for now.